I won't say very much, but I'll make a few remarks about what is commonly known as Pax Americana, something that very few of you will have lived under, but I did. And as a Western European, largely benefited from. I probably wouldn't say that if I were a South American, but as I grew up in the Netherlands, my mother was British, my father was Dutch. So I grew up in the shadow of World War II and very much under the roof of Pax Americana. Now, it's often assumed that Pax Americana was really American imperialism, the American empire taking over quite deliberately from the British Empire after World War II. Actually, like most things, it wasn't as intentional as all that. It is true that already during the war, Winston Churchill had fantasies about Britain and America policing the world together. But Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, was not that way inclined, and in fact, always wanted to involve Stalin, and on various occasions was rather prone to sidelining Churchill in order not to offend Stalin and the Soviet Union. And after the war, when the United Nations was founded as part of the post-war order, it was the Soviet Union that had ideas of policing the world together with the Americans, dividing the world up and dividing their duties. But this, of course, never happened either. There were too many countries who had no desire to live in that kind of world order at all. So that came to nothing. But gradually, Pax Americana did emerge largely out of the Cold War. It was the Cold War that made it reality in the form of international institutions like the IMF and so on, but also NATO and other institutions that bound the West together in the Cold War with the Soviet Union in particular, and communism in general. But there was, of course, there's a longer history to this, even though it wasn't as intentional as many people think. And I think the blueprint for the post-war order, as the Americans and the British and the West in general saw it, really came from the Atlantic Charter that was drawn up by Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt in 1941 in a bay off Newfoundland in Canada. And it wasn't an agreement, it wasn't a treaty, but it was a kind of blueprint of what they wanted the post-1945 world to look like, which was a world of international cooperation, national independence, freedom, economic cooperation, and so on. And this would then be overseen by the Anglo-Saxon powers, as the French would call them, Britain as a junior partner more and more, and America as the sort of the major force. But even there, I think there's a longer history that explains this aspiration of the largest English-speaking countries to run an international order. And I think there are really two strands to this, especially if you talk about America. One is the Enlightenment, which is one of the subjects of this conference, the idea that an order based on reason and science and so on is universal. And the Americans and the American Revolution, like the French Revolution, very much laid claim to being universal, to representing universal values, and therefore had the kind of mission to spread these universal values of reason and democracy and freedom and so on across the world. It's one of the reasons, I think, that the Americans and the French have always had such a difficult relationship. I mean, it's sort of love-hate, really. I mean, the Statue of Liberty in New York was gifted to the Americans by the French, and not for nothing. They both had revolutions that claimed universality based on the Enlightenment. But you can't have two universalist powers. And the French and the Americans have often rubbed one another the wrong way in that sense. But there's another historical background, I think, to this claim to universalism, which is Christianity, and particularly the Protestant kind of Christianity that is very powerful and remains powerful in the United States. And the missionary spirit of Christianity in general, perhaps less true of Russian Orthodoxy than it is of the Protestantism in Western Europe and America. But the missionary spirit there, again, lays claim to universal values. And because these values are universal, it's the mission of Protestants to spread these values all over the world. And not just Protestants, Catholics have this too, but in the case of the United States and Britain, there is a long Protestant notion that somehow these nations, these English-speaking nations, are not only Christian, but also represent freedom, democracy, and Christianity in a unique and yet universal way that really should be adopted by the rest of mankind. And this ties in with this old notion in the United States of America called American destiny. That it's the destiny of the Americans of the United States to spread freedom all over the world. And this oscillates throughout American history with the contrary tendency, which is to isolate itself. The American idea of we escaped from the old world, we're comfortable here, why should we bother about foreign conflicts? We'll close the borders and be happy on our own and not let others involve us in their quarrels. And these two tendencies, the mission to spread democracy and the other tendency of isolation, have both been present in the history of the United States. Now, as the French and the Americans know from their history, even though it's a lesson learnt and unlearned constantly, is that even if you believe that your values are universal and based on reason and freedom and fraternity and so on, countries don't like it very much when those values are imposed with military force. Even people who can agree that freedom, egalitarianism and fraternity, liberty, egalitarianism, fraternity are good things, don't like it when Napoleon's armies, for example, come and impose these values on others. And they don't like it when the Americans do the same thing in the late 20th century and early 21st century. So I think it's a lot of foolish wars were embarked on by the United States during the Cold War, partly because of this missionary zeal, that it's the United States mission to spread democracy, and partly as a result of World War II, and I've just written a book about this, that the image of Churchill as the bulldog face of liberty, the great war hero, and the fear of repeating the debacle of Munich in 1938, when the Prime Minister, Chamberlain, made a deal with Hitler's Germany to let them take a chunk of Czechoslovakia in return for a promise of peace. The fear of repeating this has spurred the Americans, and often the British, usually the British as their junior partners, in embarking wars in Vietnam, in Korea and other places. Whenever there was a foreign crisis and the question came up whether the United States should intervene, these twin ghosts of the past would emerge. The face of Churchill as the great war hero who should be the model for US presidents to emulate, and the ghost of Munich and Chamberlain and appeasement that should be avoided at all costs. Now, the victory of 1945, which was of course shared by the Soviet Union and Britain and America and Canada and so on, the Allies, I think created, let's call it the hubris that laid the basis for future problems in the world. Of course, when I grew up, the role played by the Soviet Union was not mentioned all that often in my classrooms. Holland was liberated by the Canadians and by the Americans and the British and by the Poles, who are not mentioned either. Nonetheless, it was a shared victory. But in Pax Americana, I think the role played by the United States, and most Americans still are taught that really the United States won the war alone and that nobody else really helped them at all, created a hubris which would end up in disaster. I think perhaps the real turning point in this was not Vietnam or Korea or minor skirmishes like the Falklands War and so on, all fought in the spirit of Winston Churchill and to avoid Chamberlain's 1938. But I think it was the Iraq War. It was fought for many different reasons, of course, but the idea that, and which was strongly believed by Tony Blair, as well as George W. Bush, both religious men, both who saw their politics with an almost missionary zeal, the idea that the Anglo-Saxon powers would once more stand shoulder to shoulder to defend freedom and topple the dictatorship and so on, was still extremely strong. And of course, it caused a disaster. One of the worst things that came out of it is that the words "fighting for democracy" would only lead to the deepest cynicism, and that when Americans talk about fighting for democracy, nobody believes a word of it anymore. And so the heart of the post-war order, or Pax Americana, in a way, was ripped out by the opportunism and the zeal of the Iraq War. Now, Donald Trump, again, came to power for many different reasons. He's one of the right-wing populists that we see all over the Western, and not only the Western world now, you see it in India and other places too. He came to power by exploiting feelings of not being recognized, being left behind, feelings of rage because of the widening gap between rich and poor and so on. So he came to power for all those reasons, but he also came to power really as a reaction to the form that Pax Americana had taken. After all, the first thing he promised his voters is that he would withdraw American troops from foreign countries. He would go back to the isolationism that President Roosevelt fought so hard against in 1940 and 1941 in order to join the Allies in the war against Nazi Germany. And his slogan, America First, is the slogan of the isolationists in the 1930s, who were often more pro-Hitler than they were pro-Churchill or indeed pro-Roosevelt. Now, Donald Trump most likely will no longer be president in another 2 months. The question is whether the kind of Pax Americana that I grew up with, already pretty broken down, will come back under President Biden. Some Europeans probably rather foolishly hope that things will simply go back to the way they always were. I think this is highly unlikely. I think the Trump years have put a great dent in the trust that people had in the United States, with all its flaws and all its foolish wars and so on. It was still the model in the West for an open society, for liberty and so on and so forth. I think the broken down nature of American political institutions, now visible to all, have greatly undermined American prestige in that sense. And nobody will really seriously see it as a model, which is not an entirely good thing, because the more of a mess that the Americans make of their democracy, the more it encourages autocrats and dictators in other countries who can then say, look, you're accusing us of rigging, or not rigging, but refusing to give up power and so on. Look at the Americans, they're doing the same thing, or torture, or whatever else it is that the Americans have been practicing in the last few years. So I think it's to be lamented, really, in many ways. But I think it is time for Europeans and Japanese and others who've been totally dependent for their security on this post-war order set up after 1945, the Pax Americana, that is, to start thinking of a world in which they will no longer be so dependent. Now, this is not going to happen very quickly. Japan and Western Europe are going to be dependent on the United States for a long time for their security, but we will not go back to the status quo ante. The American model is no longer convincing and no longer trustworthy. Now, the problem with this, and I'll end up on that happy note, is that neither China nor Russia are particularly wonderful alternatives to the kind of order that I was lucky enough to grow up in.
Great. Ian, thank you very, very much. And thank you for ending on that note, because it's something that I wanted to put back to you. I'll have a couple of questions, and then Bobo Lowe wants to come in as well. And then we'll go more broadly. We'll read out at least some of the questions that are pouring in from our participants. There's a well-known phrase, I think coined originally by a scholar of imperialism in the 19th century, that the British Empire was created in a fit of absence of mind. And just picking up on your ideas about the US, not particularly thinking through that it would form an imperial power after the war, but it did and has done until now. You could say it did so in a fit of absence of power, of absence of a global power, which it saw as necessary. And it has had that policeman role for several decades. Now it does seem to be withdrawing. And as you say, it wasn't just Trump. Obama was also withdrawing after Trump. Assuming we have an after Trump, Biden will probably continue. Will we miss it, even given the disaster of the Iraq War? If and when, as now, there are no Western interventions. There was no Western intervention in Syria. It was a very large Russian intervention and still is. Is that better? Is the fact that America, Britain, Western countries generally never intervene in massacres of people by their own rulers, as is the case of Iraq, is that better? Or are we going to simply have to live with the fact that it's bad, and there you go?
You mean that military intervention is bad?
No, not military intervention. That what military intervention is supposed to stop, and was said to be there to stop, was the dictatorship and the killing, the massacre in the case of Iraq, of Saddam's own people. If that's no longer punishable, is that better?
You're talking really then about the concept of humanitarian intervention, yes, which became popular in 1990s, I suppose.
Yeah, the responsibility to protect.
Yes. I've become much more skeptical about that. I mean, as you grow older, you realize in what ways you've changed your mind over the course of your life. I used to be a much greater believer in the 1980s in the benign aspects of Western or American humanitarian intervention in order to stop terrible things from happening in other countries. And I myself used Munich as an argument by saying we can't do as Chamberlain did. If we see something terrible, we have to put a stop to it. I've become more skeptical about that, because I think before you intervene in other countries with military force, you have to be absolutely sure that you're not going to make things worse. And in most cases, I think you do. And so if there is no other reason except a political one So if there's no argument for self-defense or anything of that sort, and I think in Europe in 1938 there was an argument for self-defense, it's usually foolish to intervene with force. Now, there are possibly other things, depending on the situation, that a great power can do to try and mitigate humanitarian disasters in other countries. You can try and isolate dictators, you can take economic measures, there are all kinds of things you can try to do. But I am more skeptical now about the idea of sending in the Marines.
Iraq clearly gives rise to skepticism. One other question before I pass over to Bobo. However, what we have been forced to do, we the West, America, Britain, Western Europe and so on, is to watch Russia come in on the side of the Syrian dictator and make things worse, or rather make the killing at a higher level, put the killing at a higher level in favor of what it did in Chechnya, what the Russians did in Chechnya, and that is kill them off and you'll solve the problem.
Yes, that is that's, I would not say that that is a better alternative. But of course, the Russians have already found out in Afghanistan to their cost that military interventions in other countries can be hugely expensive to the country that intervenes, as well as unfortunate for those who are at the sharp end of it.
But they haven't learned it from Syria. Anyway, Bobo, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, John. Ian, I'm glad that you mentioned the Iraq War, because I do feel that a lot of the debate today about the crisis of the liberal order tends to assign almost 100% of the blame to Trump. Whereas it seems to me, looking from the outside, that the liberal order was already self-destructing, not just with the Iraq invasion, but also the mismanagement of the war in Afghanistan, the policy failures over Syria and Libya, and indeed the global financial crisis. So it was a combination not just of perceived immorality, but also sheer ineptitude. So no longer the connection between liberal democracy and effective governance and power was broken. And I wondered whether that was a problem. Now, just my question to you is, you talk about, in a sense, if we're going to revive the liberal order, then it clearly cannot be on the same basis as before. But that does raise the question, of course, on what basis can a liberal order be revived? Because it's almost as if everyone wants the United States to lead in some way, just not quite in the way that it used to. So even the Chinese are not ready to create an alternative world order, despite what the US Defense and Department thinks. Even Russia doesn't want to see a hegemonic succession from the United States to China. So really, and the Europeans, they talk a lot about strategic autonomy, but are they ready to step up to the plate? So I'd be interested to hear more from you about the practicalities of moving to a new liberal world order.
Yes, well, this is not something in which I'm an expert, but I'll say something also about the collapse of the liberal order, which and this may sound a little provocative, but I think in some ways Donald Trump is also the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And by that I mean that until 1989 and 1990, the West, during the Cold War, needed an alternative to the communist propaganda or promise of equality and so on. And so social democracy did not come from arise for nothing. We needed an alternative view of spreading wealth relatively equitably and so on and so forth. And I think I already said that there was hubris coming from 1945, but there was also hubris coming from 1989 to 1990. and that the West no longer really saw it as necessary to have an alternative to communism because the communist empire had collapsed. And so the kind of neoliberal order that, of course, began under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan already, but then became the norm under George Bush, the father. And the disparities in wealth, the widening gap between rich and poor and so on, which have caused so much popular anger, are also a result of that. And as a result of that, I mean, we have Trump and the populists in various countries in Europe. Now, how can the liberal order be restored? It cannot be restored, I don't think, by having a hegemon. That's what we thought with the New World Order that came out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that as the French called it, the hyperpuissance of America. That's not going to happen. So I think there will have to be very strong alliances between the United States, East Asian countries, Europe, and so on. But there will have to be more autonomy, because the Pax Americana, as it was set up after the war, was based on a deal. And the deal was, you all, the allies, can take care of rebuilding your economies and your industries and so on, and we'll take care of all your security. And this was very comfortable for the Europeans and the Japanese and others. But that's no longer sustainable. In that sense, Trump is right and Obama was right. I mean, that the Europeans should do more. That doesn't mean that they will be, that the EU will somehow replace the Americans as sort of an independent superpower. It's not a superpower. It's not a state. But that Europeans, and particularly the Germans, I think a lot of it, I mean, when I grew up, I never would have thought I would be saying this, but that we need the Germans to be stronger and play a more important military role. And the same is true in East Asia. The Japanese have to start seriously debating their pacifist constitution and so on. So the alliance needs to be looser, less totally dependent on the United States, but it could still be an alliance. And what you say about China, I think, is absolutely right, because they're in a dilemma, because they say they want the United States out of Asia, and they want to be the traditional hegemon in Asia, the Middle Kingdom and all that. But the smarter Chinese also realize that if the Americans do not police East Asia and the seas there, the Japanese will start developing a nuclear bomb, and they'll have to try and do it. They can't ever be a power on the same level as the Chinese, but they'll have to balance it in some way. And I think most Chinese would still probably rather have the Americans as the policemen than the Japanese.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. I'll pass it to Ina for her for interventions and questions from our very big audience. So, Ina.
Thank you. Yes, as I said, we're many people and we have many questions. Interestingly, that a few questions have already been addressed. Like Yelena Markova basically asked the same question that John started this conversation with. So I believe we can skip that. And Yelena Veselkova is asking about the crisis of democracy and the rise of popularity of left wing, which we also touched. So I suggest we slightly turn to a different perspective. A question from Claudia Crawford, the director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Vienna's office. How to overcome polarization in our societies? And another question from Germany, from Barbara von O-Freitag, International Relations Advisor. How can the tide towards digital authoritarianism be checked before it's too late for the societies? And the question from Ukraine, Alena Goroshko, Universalism and Post-Truth Society, what is the linkage? So I think we stay with these three and then we move on, okay?
Yeah, well, those are very big questions that I can't answer adequately, obviously, but I can have a stab at them. How to overcome polarization? I think that depends on the society. I don't think you can give one general glib answer to that. My view is that in a country like the US, where the differences between rich and poor are so huge now, almost grotesquely so, and where you have two forms of polarization. One is economic, but the other one is cultural, and you have this culture war between, and you see this inside the Democratic Party, for example. You have two kinds of left. You have the left like that's represented by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, which is very much about healthcare and redistribution of wealth, higher taxes for the wealthy and that kind of thing. And then you have the sort of culture war left that stresses the rights of transsexuals, gay people, very strongly concentrating on racism and what they call white supremacy and so on, which is particularly strong at universities and arts institutions and the liberal media. And on the other side, on the right one, the Republican side, you have cultural warriors of another kind who care most about things like abortion, the right to carry guns and so on. Now, there's very little that you can do really to bring the different sides of the culture war together, because these are not interests that can be rationally debated and solved peacefully. These are existential attitudes. But you can perhaps find some kind of way to close the gap if you concentrate on the economy, which is what I would hope they will do in a Biden administration. I would hope that they would tamp down on the culture war and talk less about white supremacy and gay rights and that kind of thing. Not that these are not important. They are important, social issues, but that they concentrate first on building infrastructure, making sure that what used to be called the working class is better off, and so on. And I think they'd find allies, possibly on the Republican side, in doing that. So less culture war, more economy. The other way in which I've changed as I get older is that I'm having more sympathy for Karl Marx than I ever did before. The second question on digital authoritarianism, I suppose what is meant is the enormous power of the internet and how conspiracy theories are spread and how millions of people are influenced by malicious nonsense and that kind of thing.
And also, I think it's about the data that governments are getting hold of, personal data of.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, I mean, that's a question of the personal data, I think, can be handled probably by having proper laws in place. And that's a glib answer, I know, and I don't have anything terribly bright to say about that. The other thing, I think, is that at some point, online journalism will have to replicate what's already has been true in print journalism, and that things will have to become much more tightly edited, filtered, and so on, and that it's no longer just a free-for-all where any kind of nonsense can go viral. But this will take a long time, and it's not something I feel that I have sufficient expertise to immediately come up with a smart answer. Universalism and post-truth. Well, the post, in some ways, Donald Trump's propaganda is an offshoot of theories that he himself would never have heard of, which started in France and universities with postmodernism and deconstructionists and so on, who have argued for a long time that truth is all a question, is all a reflection of relative power. And there is no such thing as truth. There is just power. And that's something that now has been taken up in a very practical way by the right-wing populists, just as it exists on the left. I deplore it. I think it's a very bad idea. On the other hand, we've also seen the disastrous results of claims to universalism. I mean, claims to universalism, it's not for nothing that those who come from monotheistic societies are more likely to think that they stand for universalism, which has to then be imposed on everybody else. And that can be just as disturbing. But I think certain things are universal. I think certain human rights are universal, but you have to narrow it down very carefully. I don't think that truth is completely relative. So we have to find our way out of this maze.
Thank you. That actually the universalism is has been the focus of this particular forum for the past 6 years, and that's very interesting. Back to the US presidential elections, but not to the damage done already. A question from Macedonia, from Jidas Daskalovsky. Will the new US president increase cooperation with Europe, and what can we expect from US relationship with Russia in the future?
Well, I think that the discourse will certainly be much politer. And Joe Biden is an internationalist. He'll, I'm sure, join the Paris Accord on climate. There will be fewer rows and insults flying around and so on. So the whole atmosphere will be much calmer, which is a good thing. I mean, even if nothing happens in the next 4 years, that would already be a welcome change from the last 4 years. But I hope that the Europeans don't simply go back to sleep and think we can leave it all up to the Americans and everything will be the way it always was. Not that this is going to lead to radical changes quickly, but I think that that moral responsibility for our own security would be a good thing in Europe. And so I'm not saying the alliance with the United States won't survive or shouldn't survive, but I think it has to be a much more equal one.
Thank you for bringing the responsibility in. That's one of our keywords that we promote. A question from St. Petersburg, Mikhail Abozov, he's asking, don't you think that crisis, economic crisis and conflicts, war conflicts are related? What are the odds if the future crisis, the economic crisis, would be worse than previous ones, and can it possibly provoke a global war conflict?
Well, I find it very hard to predict things. I think it's probably true that that economically things are going to get worse than they are now in the next year or so. I mean, almost inevitably, as a result of COVID, we're going to go into a deep crisis. And this is one area where I think democracies have an advantage, which is that in bad economic times, there are political mechanisms that can absorb a lot of the popular anger and discontent and so on, simply because people have the right to vote out the rascals and change policies by voting and so on. I think a serious economic crisis in a country like China would be extremely serious, because the monopoly on power of the Communist Party in China is no longer really based on Marxism, Leninism, or any ideological concept like that. It's based, on the one hand, on nationalism, but on the other hand, it's based on the deal with the urban middle classes, the elites. That a deal, by the way, which is analogous, not the same, but analogous to similar sort of deals made in Japan and in Singapore and well, particularly in those two countries, that the middle class, and especially their children, students and so on, will be given the conditions to be prosperous, to lead the kind of lives that they like, to buy expensive cars and Louis Vuitton bags and go traveling and so on, but stay out of politics. That's the deal. And the deal will hold as long as the urban elites feel that they are getting more and more prosperous and can buy the Louis Vuitton bags and go to Paris and Rome for holidays and so on. In the case of a serious economic decline, the deal could break. And that would have serious political consequences in China, in a country like China, I think. And that could lead to a crisis in the Communist Party. And the first thing they are likely to do then is to ramp up the nationalism. And that would be a nationalism that would be by definition hostile to outside powers, Japan, the United States in particular, and could lead to conflict. I'm not saying it will, but the risk is certainly there.
Interesting. Well, a good friend of ours and one of our key experts, Hai Rong-yan, many years ago wrote a long read that we published in our quarterly journal, and the topic was how compatible is Confucianism and democracy. And it was a very long text, and at the end of it he says, basically, there is no answer. We do not know that. Although many people are going from China to Ivy League universities and coming back to China with presumably the ideas of democracy, but we do not know whether they're going to implement those or they're just learning how the West is organized. And actually the next questions I have here is from Moscow, Russia, Artyom Torchinsky. He's asking about Uyghurs in China, and we learned a lot recently about the camps for Uyghurs. And his question is there any chance that we hear something from the West rather than just concerns? And I would add to that, because we hear about Uyghurs, we don't hear about Tibet much, and I'm following it closely, and I know that the similar camps are there for Tibetan people and no one is talking about it. What would you say to that?
Well, we can talk about it more and probably should talk about it more. The question is, what can we do about it? And I think very little. It's not something that anybody, least of all the United States, is going to risk a world war over. And there is very little. I mean, China is a modern, very powerful country, and I don't see very much that the West can do to improve the situation in Tibet or for the Uyghurs. Yes, you could say more economic pressure could be brought to bear, but that would hurt Western interests. So it's very hard to see how they would do that. I mean, the difference between the Soviet Union and China is that in the case of the Soviet Union, and even then, there was very little that the West could really do about problems inside the Soviet Union or its satellites. I mean, after all, we remember how the Voice of America in the 1950s were more or less encouraging the Hungarians to rise up against the Soviet Union. And when they did, what did Eisenhower do? Nothing.
But we were officially at war with each other, Cold War, while US and China are partners.
That is true, but the difference is one of the differences. A similarity is that nobody wanted to risk a world war over these things, but the difference is that there are huge business interests in China, Western business interests. And you can't ignore it, whereas there weren't great business interests in the Soviet Union. I mean, there wasn't very much business with the Soviet Union, whereas with China, that overrides everything.
That's the point. I mean, we do realize what is at stake, but I really think that this is a task for civil society to raise their voice and to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves.
Raising voices is always good, but the question is, how far does that go?
Well, at least something to start with.
Yes.
A question about a pandemic from Thomas Poe, Special Uruguay Deputy Head of Mission. To what extent is the COVID pandemic helping the autocracies?
Again, it depends on which autocracies. On the whole, autocracies are not doing very well with the pandemia. Look at Brazil, for example. The Chinese seem to have solved it relatively well, and which of course is used by the Chinese government as an argument for autocracy. They say, look, in these messy democracies, and they can't take any decisions, there's no discipline, it's a total mess and everything's running out of control. That is true in the United States, where they could have handled it better, or Britain. How much better, I don't know, because the French and the Italians were very strict, and it's not that much better there than it is in the US. But apart from China, I don't think the autocracies have handled it any better than anyone else. So I don't think it's a terribly good argument for. In fact, if you look at the Chinese world, the Taiwanese have handled it just as well as the PRC, and that's a vibrant democracy.
Thank
Ian,
you. Yes.
Can I just a quick,
yes.
added on to that? You can argue that the Chinese have handled the pandemic well as a domestic public health issue, but there's surely an equally compelling argument that they've handled the international politics of coronavirus abysmally badly, that in fact the backlash against China, not just in the West, but across much of the non-Western world, is tremendous, and that in fact China's international reputation, China faces more international pressure today than it has done since, well, 3 decades, since the aftermath of Tiananmen. Or how do you respond to that?
Yes, but I wonder if that wouldn't have happened without the coronavirus as well. I mean, they make a great deal out of the fact that they have handled it better domestically. And yes, in the beginning, you remember, I mean, when they were sending large numbers of face masks and that kind of thing to Europe, which turned out to be defective. But I remember in March, people were praising the Chinese and saying, look at what the Chinese are doing for us, and the Americans are doing nothing. Yeah. So yes, they did mishandle it, and their diplomacy has been very unsubtle, to put it mildly. So you're right, but I think the relations were fraying and will continue to fray anyway.
Yeah, fair enough.
Thank you. A question now about informational hygiene, and how is it possible to start the culture of informational hygiene, and how do you see the media landscape of the nearest future? What is it, TV versus internet, podcasts? And this is from Ilya Arifulin from Russia, Yaroslavl.
So this is really a similar question to the one before, but how the internet operates, right?
What do you think? What will actually take over? Will it be the content that is generated by states, or will it be the content generated by people themselves?
Well, that depends on the nature of the state. In an open society, in a democracy, most of the content will not be disseminated by the state. It'll be disseminated by private citizens, it seems to me. If that's the question. If the question is, how do we stop this pernicious situation that we have today, that the state, as well as private citizens, can disseminate very damaging and fallacious information, which affects millions often. I mean, take, for example, what Donald Trump is doing now. The great danger is that he's engaging in what the Germans did in 1918 with their Dolchstoß Legende, the myth that they didn't lose the war, but they were stabbed in the back by socialists and Jews and liberals and so on. And what Trump and that undermined the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic. And what Trump is doing through the internet largely is telling his supporters that the election was rigged, that it was stolen, and so on, and therefore a Biden administration will not be legitimate. And that's really just extremely damaging to the democratic system as it is, because it has to be based on trust. It has to be based on the acceptance that if you lose an election, you live under a government you didn't choose. And the fact that that kind of information, in this case from people who are in the highest positions in the administration, but in other cases they could be private operators. But the fact that the internet allows people to have such enormous influence, often for very damaging and bad ideas, is a real problem. Now, how do you police that? If I had the answer, I probably would be a lot richer and more powerful than I am today.
A question about climate from Russia, Rostov, Anton Khvostov. What do you think, how can we drag people's attention to the problem of climate change that can easily turn into catastrophe if we don't? And earlier today we addressed that quickly. Sergei Guriev said that actually the young generations are on it. They're panicking, but they're panicking not because they don't know what to do, they do know, but because they just cannot let go. What do you think, what else can be done? How can we make it louder?
Well, I think panicking is probably the worst response, because panic stands in the way of rational thinking. And a lot of these problems need a lot of very sophisticated scientific thinking, and panicking about it and seeing it as a kind of, almost as a kind of religious issue isn't really going to help very much. And so I think there are two ways that it should be approached. One is a scientific way, to put as much resources into scientific people who are looking for scientific solutions to this. The other is, and in that sense, I think Joe Biden is not a bad future president, at least in his ideas. The other thing is to make it clear that dealing with climate change and having cleaner industries and that kind of thing could actually be an economic boon, and could be in people's economic interest to do this, and is not just taking away jobs, but it could be harnessed to things that the opposite. Now, this has not always been argued very well, but I think it's a good argument.
I think we will have the last question, and then we turn to Yura and Lena and John and Bobo. The last question is a bit tricky, from Dagestan, Russia, Marina Kovaleva. She is asking, what do you think in the modern society, what will prevail, rights or responsibilities? And is there a way to find a balance?
Well, rights can't exist without responsibilities. And I know that that's a glib answer, but I mean, you can't have rights if people aren't responsible in the way that they act upon them. And so they're inextricably bound together. I think people in different countries also do react slightly differently to these things. For example, the right to free speech in America is more absolute in legal terms in the Constitution than it is in European countries. European countries have laws against hate speech and so on that do not exist in the United States. In the United States, legally, you're allowed to say anything unless you can prove that it leads to imminent danger, which is a much looser concept than it is in Europe. But as a result, possibly as a result, and here we come to the rights and responsibility question. As a result, the informal rules on what you can and cannot say in America are taken much more seriously. And Americans take offense more quickly to what they think is something that should not be said. And whereas in countries where they have stronger laws, there are fewer informal constraints. So you couldn't have something like Le Canard Enchaîné, the French satirical magazine in the United States. It's unthinkable, even though the laws in the United States are actually give people more freedom. So on freedom of speech, you have informal rules and formal rules. And you could say that the more formal the rules, the less people take advantage of the informal ones, etc.
Thank you very much. We really are running out of time. We have more questions in the chat, and I mean, the only solution I can see at this point is that you can give us a hope to come back to us and talk again to our participants. I hope Lena and Jura will say something too, and Bobo and John.
Oh, I'm done.
Let me, Ina, let me come in before Jura and Lena put the final stop on it. Ian, many thanks, not just for the talk, which was fascinating, but also for every kind of question, for facing up to every kind of question as well as you did. And I'll echo what Ina said. We all hope that you'll come back sometime soon.
Well, next year in Moscow, I hope.
Even in person.
Wherever that be. I mean, really, we're open to we work beyond borders, and we would totally love to have you back. Thank you
I can't wait to come to Russia again.
Very good.
We'll work on that. We'll work on that.
Please.
Lena. Lena нет звука. So we're wrapping up, and now we are moving to the next session where we actually do have Lena and Jura. Thank you so very much again, Ian.
It was a pleasure.
Bobo, John, and everyone who was asking questions. And we definitely have to come. But that was a very beautiful and fruitful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.